Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. Today, I welcome Dr. Benjamin Bikman to the show, who is a researcher, author, and lecturer at BYU, and recently wrote the book, Why We Get Sick, which is an excellent foray into tying together all of the chronic diseases that ravage our society now, providing a framework around how we can think about addressing them all at once and thinking about them from the root cause, really. And so a lot of his work has been done in insulin resistance, and we dive into that topic in depth today, but we also get into a lot of the nitty gritty and tactical things that you can do to sort of hedge your bets against getting chronic disease. A lot of this stuff is really dependent too on genetics. We don't really address that, but a lot of environmental things can go a long way at preventing chronic disease, or so we both think. So tune into this one. We go back and forth a lot. It gets heavy at some points, but then we pull back out and try to summarize things and make it actionable for people as well. So tune in, and I hope you enjoy. This episode of The Natural State is sponsored by Ned. Ned is an incredible company that makes a lot of CBD products, and you guys can probably go back to some of my episodes and realize that I have been a CBD skeptic for a very long time. I think that it's really hard in this industry that's exploding to have really high quality products that actually do anything. I tried a bunch of different CBD brands before this one, and unless they had THC in them as well, not enough to get high, but just enough to amplify the effects of CBD, I didn't feel anything until I tried Ned and then was completely blown away. I'd been using their products before they sponsored the show for about 4 to 6 months and have noticed a huge increase the nights that I use their product, about 25 milligrams, so 50 milligrams per night of the CBD. And I sleep way better. But then also the most interesting part is my HRV, as tracked by my Oura Ring, the next morning is about 20 points higher the day that I use CBD versus not. I also have not been doing a lot of social drinking as of this year. So anybody who's been following my stuff knows that I've sort of been taking the backseat to any sort of glass of wine here, drink there, to take the edge off. And the last few months, I'm sure everybody in the world feels a little stressed out. And I've been doing the same amount, like 25 to 50 milligrams, to sort of replace that glass of wine to wind down and de-stress. And it's been pretty remarkable to pull down the edge and make sure that I can just calm down at night with all that's going on in the world. The founders are amazing people. They really care about their supply chain, their sourcing. They do things the right way. And I asked them to hook you guys up with a little bit of a discount code. So if you want to try Ned out, just go to helloned.com/AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. That's HELLONED.com/AG15. That's AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. This show is also brought to you by Blue Blocks, blue light blocking glasses. Blue light is one of these things that a lot of people do not realize is completely trashing their sleep. So this is verified, at least for me. I've looked at my Oura Ring, and anytime I get blue light exposure from devices past, say, 4 p.m., the latency, the time it takes for me to fall asleep, as well as my deep sleep, are completely diminished. And when I wear glasses like Blue Blocks, it completely reverses that, and I can get a full rested sleep with no problem. There are a lot of brands out there right now that are trying to get on this trend of blocking blue light for good reason. And what happens is most of them are either really cheap and they break super easily, they are terrible looking and make you look like a freaking goon, or they actually just don't work. So I've tried some out that, are sort of a spectrum of any of these things, all the way to being so dark that I get headaches from wearing them. And what I like about Blue Blocks is it sort of addresses all of these things. So they're made actually in Australia, really, really high quality stuff. They have 20 plus different styles of each one. So no matter what sort of style fits your head and your face, my face is sometimes a little tough to make look good. So I'm glad they have options for me. But also they test all of their lenses to make sure that they meet specific criteria to block very specific wavelengths of light. And this is the important part here. Not a lot of brands do this. And so I've actually tested their side by side. I mean, you can do this as easily as just looking at a spectrum of blue, and you put on their glasses and you can't see the blue anymore. It goes completely black or it has a shade of a gray. And this is what you want. And these guys who have done this company have done a phenomenal job at really sourcing the highest quality lenses, highest quality frames, and the ones that actually look good. So I'm not embarrassed when I put these on in public. And I asked them if they could hook you guys up, and they obliged. So 15% off is yours if you use code AG15. Also, you get free shipping. So if you want to, just head to BLUBLOX.com and use code AG15. That's blueblocks.com. Use code AG15 for 15% off and free shipping. Doc, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, Anthony. Thanks, brother. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I was super excited to get you on and record just because so much of the work you do sort of looks like a lot of what I've gone through over the last, 6, 7, 8 years now. I sort of lose track, but in my former life and career, I got a doctorate in chiropractic and master's in sports rehab, and was just fascinating with people with musculoskeletal injuries, how to get people better with physical pain. And the more I saw people in my clinic with physical pain, the more I realized that people are just generally far sicker than problems with achy joints or bones or muscles, things like that. And started digging into it way more and trying to figure out why are people so sick and why do people have these problems. And I think that doing that led me to doing more functional medicine work, then led me to doing more stuff and eventually launching and scaling Perfect Keto as a resource to help people. As I realized people were so sick in so many different ways, but there was sort of a common root cause. And that's obviously what a lot of your work is as well, is trying to figure out sort of, why are people so sick right now? I mean, your recent book called Why We Get Sick is obviously an investigation. Yeah. So I was just curious in sort of your rabbit hole and how you got there to sort of this tying everything together in your career.
Right. Yeah. So we were on similar journeys. I was coming at it, of course, not from the angle of a clinician like you were, necessarily. For me, of course, it was just strictly from science, which is a wonderful foundation to build on. Of course, it provides a fairly indefensible foundation, defensible. It's easily defended. I can back up much of my sentiment or all of it by citing very specific studies. So the book, of course, that's a bit of an on-the-nose title, The Why We Get Sick, but I meant it, and I wanted it to be provocative, and then back it up. I had towards the end of my master's degree in exercise physiology, actually, I had this pretty abrupt shift. I had lost interest in muscle cells, or some of my interest had waned, and my interest shifted to fat cells. And that was because of one study I'd stumbled on, which outlined that fat cells, as they get fat, as they grow in size, they start secreting pro-inflammatory cytokines. And that, at the time, was such an incredible realization. It not only showed me that fat cells are endocrine organs, which had already been known. We already knew that fat cells released leptin. I just didn't know that at the time. So this was the first realization I'd had, that fat cells are endocrine organs secreting proteins into the blood that affect cells throughout the body. But then it also provided a connection between obesity and type 2 diabetes, namely this obesity-induced insulin resistance. And that is a paradigm that still stands. It is valid. It is backed up by data, significant data. And that, again, is what resulted in the shift to focus more on the fat cell. And then I followed that up with very direct interests in fat cells and inflammation with my dissertation, my doctoral work, and then my postdoctoral fellowship. It was more of the same. More specifically looking at how different types of fats can cause insulin resistance within the cell. And there's a lot of misunderstanding there, and I won't elaborate at the moment. But at the time, I thought insulin resistance was only relevant to type 2 diabetes. A person is becoming increasingly resistant to the effects of their own insulin, especially at the muscle, and that insulin just can't help the glucose stay in control. And thus the glucose levels start to rise, and then now we detect the problem as type 2 diabetes. And again, at the time, I thought insulin resistance was only relevant to type 2 diabetes. And it was when I started teaching my class, when I got hired as a professor 10 years ago, I was assigned a class called pathophysiology. So the students have had physiology when they've come to me, so they know how the the organs, the tissues in the body work, the systems work when they work well, in other words, in a healthy setting. And then I teach the problems, what the tissues are doing, how they're working when they're not working well. So diseases. I was so unfamiliar with that overall topic, despite being a diabetes obesity scientist, that I was desperate to find things that I could talk about with a great degree of authority, so that my students could look at me as an authority and have some degree of respect for their professor. And so I would try to find instances of insulin resistance being relevant. And so I see this, of course, with type 2 diabetes, that lecture is very easy. I can present the disease and then highlight the relevance of insulin resistance in that disease. And then I'd known that insulin resistance was relevant to hypertension. And so I, incorporated that into the hypertension lecture as well, just as sort of an aside. These would always be little almost afterthoughts in the lecture. I'd present the general disease and then highlight some of the role of insulin resistance. And then the more I kept looking, the more it kept popping up. Fatty liver disease, infertility in men and women, Alzheimer's disease, and joint disorders, sarcopenia, so muscle wasting. Insulin resistance just continued to be relevant in all of these chronic diseases that we all are afraid of to varying degrees. And after realizing how little known that was the beginning of the book. I'd like to think that there's a lot of power in that knowledge, where if someone can be, they can open their medicine cabinet each morning and they will see their medications for their diabetes, their medications for their migraines, headaches, their medications for their infertility, and then realize after reading this book, for example, that all of those problems are to varying degrees manifestations of insulin resistance. And so one, they can recognize that they don't have to be kind of trying to cut down little branches that are always going to be regrowing on this tree of disease. They can go right to the root and acknowledge that the common root here is insulin resistance. And once we acknowledge that most of the chronic diseases are in fact manifestations of insulin resistance, not always and not to every degree, but often and to a large degree, they would recognize insulin resistance and then recognize that lifestyle is by far the best way to address the insulin resistance. And that is what led me ultimately to this, maybe 8 years ago or so, to this growing, and by that time, I guess, solid appreciation that a low-carb diet is the most effective way to lower insulin in someone who's insulin resistant, and thus it is the most effective way of improving insulin resistance. And that's why, that's a long-winded answer. Yeah. So that's my interest in insulin resistance at the heart of most chronic disease, and then how that sort of bled into me appreciating a low-carb diet.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of funny how you say that. It was very obvious initially for you that the connection to type 2 diabetes and even obesity was very clear. And it seems like everybody who's gone down this path is like, that's the first entry point. Like, oh, this is really fascinating. These are big problems. And then there seems to be presented this elegant solution that all chronic diseases, to a certain degree, have some association with this and some downstream effect from insulin resistance. And so, I mean, as you write in the book, and I think that a lot of people are saying this now. I mean, when I first came across this idea and again kept digging and found the same sort of truths, I thought this has to be too simple to make sense. Yeah. This is like one problem is causing all of our health issues. So I don't know if you went through a point about that and like how you sort of think of it now, where it's just like, okay, solve that first, and then if there are downstream things, we can focus on A, B, or C condition. But sort of like, what was the point for you when you go, okay, yes, this is real, this is true, that as sort of a precondition towards the atherosclerosis, neurodegenerative disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, et cetera, we sort of need to have this presentation of insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a delicate assumption in a way, where I wouldn't want someone to hear this discussion or read my book and think Ben is claiming that insulin resistance is the root of literally every disease. Right. And I'm certainly not claiming that, but it really is. It's just shocking when you look at how strong the data are, and that that started really after a brief lecture series that I'd given here at the university. So from time to time, my university will have professors. They'll invite professors just to do a week-long series, just that people from the public can just sign up for. And I looked at that as a fun challenge to really crystallize these thoughts that I'd been, sort of lightly touching on in my class for a few years. And at the end of the week, it was standing room only in this auditorium of, that could seat 600 people. And I couldn't believe the response, and so many people at the end of it asking where they could buy the book. And that's when I first thought, I got to write a book, and because no one else is saying this. But there's so much nuance to many of these diseases, and insulin undeniably has a role in them, and that's at least partly because literally every cell in the body has insulin receptors. Red blood cells, white blood cells, our neurons, our joints, it doesn't matter. The cells in the gonads, every cell has insulin receptors, and thus insulin is telling every cell in the body to do something. And what is so insidious about insulin resistance is how selective the insulin resistance is. And this is, it's worth, I guess, elaborating very, very briefly. That's with insulin resistance, it's that some cells are resistant to insulin, and insulin is now compromised in eliciting a cellular action or a cellular response at those cells. Like, for example, the muscle cell. Muscle cells become insulin resistant, and a part of that is they cannot pull in glucose as well, so blood glucose levels start to climb. And that's relevant because muscle is the main consumer of glucose in the body by a wide margin. And also insulin helps defend muscle proteins. And so as the muscle becomes insulin resistant, you have more breakdown of muscle protein and muscle wasting. In contrast, you have other cells that never become insulin resistant, like, for example, the theca cells in the ovaries. And so insulin now is continuing to act as well as it ever did. But because the body is insulin resistant and insulin is elevated, and that's debated nowadays. And I don't know what the debate is necessarily, but it is an undeniable feature of actual insulin resistance in the human body. I believe indeed that there's not a single exception to this. Insulin is elevated in insulin resistance. The cells that are insulin resistant, they don't care about the elevated insulin. It's not working well anyway. But like, say, the theca cells of the ovaries that are producing estrogens, now they are getting inundated with insulin. And so insulin is doing too much of what it did before. And in this case, insulin inhibits the conversion of testosterone into estrogens. It inhibits that enzyme that mediates that flip, because all estrogens were once testosterone in men and women. Women just convert more of that testosterone into estrogens than men do. Insulin inhibits that. And so that's a perfect example of a cell that's not explicitly suffering from insulin resistance. It's suffering from the hyperinsulinemia of the insulin-resistant state in the body, which in her body is now causing too many cysts to form, too many follicles to form in her ovaries, but never one ovulating because she doesn't have that estrogen spike. And now she has developed polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is absolutely at its core a metabolic disease, namely a disease of insulin. So again, a long-winded answer. I wouldn't claim that insulin resistance is the single variable in every disease, not at all, but it is a common theme. It is a common variable across virtually every disease. And so we have a tremendous power to improve our health by addressing that one single cause and not have to worry about all the perhaps peripheral causes that may be relevant but distinct to individual diseases. Let's address a whole bunch of disease with one single target.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned before how lifestyle is the best way, once you do have insulin resistance, to make a shift and sort of go back to a normal state, a normal metabolic state. And just, within that, you said, okay, low carbohydrate diet is one of the best ways to do that. What about getting to an insulin resistant state? Is there one main way that you think people are getting there? Is it just by eating too many carbohydrates? Is it polyunsaturated fatty acid consumption being out of control compared to historical levels? Like, what is your sort of thinking on the source of insulin resistance? Or is it a combination of diet, nutrition, people not moving, environmental problems, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So this is, of course, a very debated topic as well. And so it's one I take seriously and one I answer very deliberately and cautiously. So insulin causes insulin resistance. I know that's debated, but I can, in fact, make cells insulin resistant just by putting insulin in the culture, even at normal physiological levels, and keeping it there. The cells will become insulin resistant. So that does point a finger at refined carbohydrates. So I will put refined carbohydrates and the insulin spike that comes from that. But I would add maybe another nuance there. It is the incessant consumption of those refined carbohydrates, because the ridiculous asinine advice that we give people is eat a high carbohydrate diet and eat 6 little meals per day. And that means someone is living every waking moment with elevated insulin, and it's keeping even their so-called fasted insulin stays higher for longer. So, the area under the curve, their insulin is elevated all the time because they're eating carbohydrates all the time. Now, without a doubt, linoleic acid is very likely a problem, but I think there's more nuance there where that is something that takes some time. Like, for example, if I put linoleic acid on cells, they don't become insulin resistant like it does, like in a day, like with insulin. In fact, it doesn't at all. I'll just say that. So there's something not as direct when it comes to linoleic acid at a cell. And in the case of linoleic acid, I believe that it. Now I'm speculating a bit here, Anthony. So appreciate that, please, and anyone listening, appreciate. I think with linoleic acid, we need to look at it in the context of the whole body. That I think at least part of the problem with linoleic acid, although there are many, but part of the problem in the context of insulin resistance in the body is that linoleic acid makes fat cells sick. And by that I mean it makes fat cells grow through hypertrophy. So each individual fat cell is growing in size, and it's preventing the fat tissue to grow through hyperplasia, which is when each fat cell is still modestly sized, but as it starts to get a little bigger, the fat tissue recruits a new fat cell to kind of share the burden. And so the fat tissue can continue to store the fat. It can continue to store that energy rather than reach a maximum dimension, like with the hypertrophic fat cells, and then become insulin resistant because insulin is trying to tell the fat cell to continue to hold on to its energy. And the fat cell has reached a maximum size, and it basically tells insulin, you want me to continue to grow. I can't. I cannot physically get any bigger. And so now it becomes insulin resistant and starts leaking fat out into the bloodstream, free fatty acids, when it shouldn't. So anyway, linoleic acid.
The hypothesis is that linoleic acid and maybe some other PUFAs as well, due to their reactive nature, block fat from growing. And I mean, this is one of the things where I think there's some research showing that, fat increasing in obesity is basically like a buffer against diabetes and insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. And so basically you're saying stopping that buffer is leading to that problem sort of downstream, less indirectly.
Yeah, that's right. That's well said. That's a good way of saying it. Where if the fat can continue to store fat, the body will become insulin sensitive. And so I do present this. I'm getting a bit off topic. I promise I'll come back. So this is I'm kind of hinting at this paradigm where the fat cell is the first cell to, fall, so to speak, with regards to insulin resistant. The fat cell becomes insulin resistant first. And then as it becomes insulin resistant, it starts leaking free fatty acids and leaking pro-inflammatory cytokines. And then that starts to spill the insulin resistance to the other tissues like the liver, the muscle, the bone, the brain. And so the fat cell is the first domino, and then it starts tipping into the rest. And so in the context of insulin, I can make liver cells insulin resistant, fat cells insulin resistant, muscle cells insulin resistant by exposing them to physiological yet consistently elevated insulin. I cannot do that with linoleic acid. I mean, I've literally done these experiments, but without a doubt, I strongly believe linoleic acid is relevant. But the evidence isn't as direct as it is with insulin, including in humans. You can infuse elevated insulin, albeit even at physiological levels, and they will become insulin resistant. That study's never been done, infusing linoleic acid, not that I know of. But I don't know that, but I guess it hasn't been done. So I can say that there's no direct effect of proving linoleic acid is relevant, despite my belief that it is. It's just not going to be as direct an effect as insulin is, but I believe it is relevant, and it would come at the level of the fat cell first, from what I believe. So, to sort of sum up to this point, chronic consumption of refined starches, I believe, is a cause of insulin resistance. Chronic consumption of refined seed oils, like soybean oil, which is the single most commonly consumed fat in the, I would say, global diet at this point. And then I will add another one, which is stress. Stress, whether it's sleep deprivation or mental anxiety, which there's a lot of course, with the uncertainties in the world, that does result in an increase in the prototypical stress hormones, cortisol and epinephrine, and they are insulin antagonists. They fight what insulin's trying to do most explicitly with regards to glucose control. Cortisol and epinephrine want to increase glucose by any means, even with cortisol stripping the muscle of its amino acids to feed gluconeogenesis at the liver. So cortisol will do it by any way it can. And so as those two are trying to push glucose ever higher, insulin, of course, has to work harder to try to keep the glucose in check. And so the stress and the hormonal response to stress is also a known cause of insulin resistance. So I guess that's to sum it up. Those three might be the most obvious ones.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, as we entered this space and both of us thought, okay, insulin is just responsible for, obesity and diabetes, very clear. Then the picture became a little bit more clear. It's like, okay, we have all these different things. I think that we're now in the moment where it was thought, I mean, this is sort of where, big keto explosion, and there's a lot of reasons why ketogenic diet is helpful. Ketones are helpful. You've done a lot of great work here. But I mean, I think that people made a simple assumption that it's just eating carbohydrates is bad and bad for all humans and going to lead to insulin resistance. And now I think the picture is becoming a little bit more complex, and it typically becomes a little bit more complex before it becomes clear again. And this is where I just think about, and I want to hear your perspective of sort of like how you think about what is a refined carbohydrate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, I like what you're saying because you're helping provide some nuance to this discussion, which is that neither of us is, and I'm certainly not beating the drum saying carbs are evil and we must avoid them at all costs. Not at all. So in general, I most simply define this like the carbohydrates to focus on as fruits and vegetables. If the bulk of their carbohydrates is coming from vegetables most easily, and even most fruits, I'm fine with that, frankly. And in many people, I don't think we even need to go one more step saying, well, but avoid the starchy vegetables that grow in the ground and avoid the tropical fruits. I mean, that is what I typically say is the next step. If the carbs grow in the ground, be careful with them, limit them. If it's a tropical fruit like pineapple, banana, mango, those are the most sugary of the fruits, and so be wary of those. But often I just keep it even simpler and say focus on fruits and vegetables, but eat them, don't drink them, don't make juices or smoothies out of them. And then the grains are, to me, the bigger offenders where they're just made of almost nothing but starch, which is digested into glucose. And so the idea that a type 2 diabetic should eat a high grain, high carbohydrate with whole wheat, whole grains, that to me is once again asinine advice. Those are incredibly easily digested and result in very high glucose. Even with me, I believe you do too, Anthony. I have a continuous glucose monitor and I track my glucose using the Levels app. And I ate a sandwich the other day. It was, that peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I was eating lunch with the kids and that's what they wanted. And I thought, oh, to hell with it. I'm going to do this. And my glucose spiked up to 160 or so. And I'm a healthy, or, even maybe a little higher, I'm a healthy guy. The only other time I've had it that high is my kids wanted to make fries in our air fryer. And so we just got some potatoes. And once again, just that pure load of glucose from those starchy foods results in a profound glucose spike. And if you're a diabetic, that's the problem. That's the disease. And so, again, I'm getting a little off topic, but don't focus on carbohydrates.
I mean, one of the ththings about I have a Levels monitor as well all the time. My fiance also has one, and just the variability between the two of us is so staggering. And this is where I've been challenging my own mental models about insulin resistance a lot in the last 6+ months, just thinking of, and just looking into, okay, what is the incidence of chronic disease and diabetes around the world, and what have people historically eaten? And I think that when you see populations, like for example, you say refined carbohydrates include like a grain, something like, let's say, a white rice, and you have people in Asian cultures, Japan notably, who have eaten a massive amount of this type of food,
Yeah.
yet have not had any sort of diabetes incidents, off the charts until they were basically introduced with polyunsaturated fatty acids and linoleic acid primarily. So
Yeah.
this is just sort of like, you're talking about different types of foods when they're available, things like that. I mean, is there an extremely strong genetic component here? And is, for instance, some cultures, equatorial or Asian cultures, would have a much better time processing and not actually have much insulin resistance with real or not, let's say real food, but refined carbs, like you say, either, sugary fruits, in equatorial populations, or white rice in Asian populations, which never really had problems from what I can tell until the vegetable oils were introduced.
Yeah. In fact, right. That's an excellent point. And I very much appreciate that as we look through history, there may be some discord with the hypothesis that I presented with regards to the origins of insulin resistance. I would say that I don't know that I said it, as I presented those three origins or three causes: chronically elevated insulin through consistent consumption of refined starches, consumption of seed oils, and stress. I wouldn't suggest that in a physiological state, or in the body, insulin resistance is unlikely to be caused by any single one. I suspect it is a confluence of these stressors, if I can collectively call them stressors, these metabolic stressors, especially high carb and high fat, I think is a combination that is dangerous. But I would add that if someone's eating high carb, I actually suspect that almost any fat, even saturated, which I have a great love for saturated fats, if you're eating high carb and high fat of any kind of fat, that's going to be a problem. But please, everyone know, the moment we start talking about these kind of population-wide studies, we're all just flying by the seat of our pants. These are not. This has not been confirmed. We have no way of truly knowing. All we can do is do what we accuse other people of doing, which is rely on epidemiology and population-wide trends. And so there's a lot of potential flaw there. But I would just say, I think that high carb and high fat is at the root of the insulin resistance explosion that we see around the world.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of those things where, epidemiology or not, I just try to think in common sense. And looking historically, no populations have really had access to diets at the same time eating a lot of carbs and a lot of fat concurrently.
Yeah, that's right.
This has
I think that's right.
Just doing that in general, then processing both of those carbs and both of those fats into unrecognizable food things that your body doesn't know what to do anything with, obviously is a recipe for disaster. But something that's interesting to me that you were saying about stress being one major cause, I never really considered the role of stress as much as you have. When you look at sort of the digging into this and thinking about Japanese population specifically has had a huge spike of diabetes, and a lot of people have pointed to, okay, this is due to mostly PUFA, but this is also like people say, okay, post World War II, we look at Japan as having this giant spike. However, post World War II, and this is the first time I'm thinking about this, just to what you were saying around stress. That's also when the Japanese culture really shifted towards production in a workplace with the salaryman and things like this, where it's you work from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day. And work is so important. And if you fail at work, it's the ultimate shame and the ultimate stress. Yeah. And so the stress levels, I'm sure if we look back, if we were to map out over our curve perceived stress, which there's no way we can do this now, but I'm sure that has also spiked quite a lot with polyunsaturated fatty acid consumption in that culture as well, which is just sort of interesting to see the confluence of that, as well as I'm sure lack of physical activity, air pollutants, environmental toxins that are in their diet, things like that. I mean, just post World War II, we've also westernized Japan to a staggering degree. So it's just, how do we parse out and say, okay, it's definitively this thing or that thing, is obviously extremely challenging.
Yeah, in fact, Japan is such a fascinating paradox because we often look at certain sections of Japan as being models of health, these kind of longest lived individuals in these certain sections. And of course, these are the longest lived. These are people of a very different generation and living still a very different lifestyle. And so you look at the explosion in diabetes, it's not among the old people, it's among the young people. It's and that's, I think, for all the reasons you mentioned, a result, all those collective, that constellation of problems that abounds in the modern world that unfortunately that younger generation has to live with. So yeah, Japan's a great example of what can happen when someone lives their, I guess, close to a traditional lifestyle, because there are those pockets where, and Japan is beautiful, such an incredible country. And I've had the great fortune of spending time there with my family. You see these little pockets of Japan where it's just shocking how traditional the lifestyle is and how slow the pace is, how quiet everything is. And I envy it greatly, actually.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that like, in general, we talk a lot about like how have we gotten to this point of high insulin resistance? How do we get out of it? And I think that we can have a lot of strategies, but I mean, it's just very simple when it comes down to it. It's just like, I mean, the way I like to think about it is try to distill things into as few words as humanly possible. And it's sort of like eat local, move often, sleep uninterrupted, be outside, have friends. Like how many 2-word ways can you get to the same kind of thing in such a complex manner? And it's just that our environment is so stacked against us. In areas where it's traditional towns, it's very easy. And so while this stuff may be simple, it's actually so hard living in a city or in a Western culture where you have awful fake food anywhere. Like getting real food is a challenge. Processing, sourcing, and cooking the food is a challenge. You have just distractions everywhere, unclean air. I mean, everything around you is a chair. And you get in a car or a bus and you go somewhere and you sit in a chair wherever you get. And so you're not actually moving or doing resistance. There's no work to be done. I mean, this is just like a recipe for disaster for the human body. Sure.
Yeah, I love what you said. In fact, you kind of took a line. You made a set of line that I always say when we start talking about some of these principles of controlling the diet, controlling carbs, prioritizing good protein, and filling with good fats, avoiding seed oils. These are such simple ideas, and you said it well. There's an art to expressing these ideas simply, but that doesn't mean they're easy. There's a difference between an idea being simple versus easy, and with the complication making it difficult is that we deal with addictions very, very explicitly, and we deal with the challenges of the modern world, which you stated. So the solutions are simple, but that doesn't make them easy.
Definitely. And so I guess, so for somebody who's listening and going, okay, this is a very overwhelming. Do I have insulin resistance? How do I figure this out? What's going on? I mean, do you have sort of an easy way for people to assess themselves and how they should be thinking about their own health?
Yeah. So, of course, the easiest, well, it's not easy, the simplest, back to the earlier topic, the simplest way would be getting just even a fasting insulin. It's not perfect, but if someone knows their insulin levels from a fasting blood test, like when they went in for their annual checkup and they got their glucose and their lipid panel, et cetera, if they know what their insulin is, that's wonderful. If insulin is below 6 or lower microunits per mil, that's a very good sign. Then you are very, very likely to have good insulin sensitivity. If, however, the person did not get their insulin measured, but they still have some access to their last blood check, they could look at their lipid panel. And this is, I joke, it's the poor man's method of determining insulin resistance, but it's extremely reliable. And that is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So look at the triglyceride number, divide it by HDL number. And if that number is less than 1.5, once again, it's a good sign, green light. You are very likely to be an insulin sensitive person. It also means that you can worry less about your LDL levels if they happen to be elevated, because they're likely to be the less atherogenic version of LDL, namely LDL pattern A, the larger, more buoyant, but that's a tangent. So if someone can measure their insulin, get it checked. If you have a lipid panel that includes triglycerides and HDL, which it always does, compare that. If it's that ratio is less than 1.5, that's a good sign. And then perhaps the simplest is that if someone is a little overweight and they have high blood pressure, so if someone knows they have hypertension, they're probably insulin resistant. And that seems like I'm just sort of pulling that out of thin air, but almost every instance of hypertension is caused by insulin resistance. It's the leading cause of hypertension. So if someone has high blood pressure and they are a little chubby, they're probably insulin resistant.
Interesting. That's a very simple way to look at it. And then, we've chatted about some stuff as far as how to make it simple. It's still pretty challenging. So when we're looking at diet and nutrition, as people are trying to get out of this hole and dig out of it, you're recommending low carb for sure. I would also say that no matter what you're trying to fix in your life or anything you're trying to avoid, if you want to just have a good experience living as a human, just stop eating vegetable oils and avoid them at all costs. And this is, again, sounds very simple, really hard to do in practicality, just because any restaurant you go to, they're going to use it in the sauce, they're going to use it in cooking anything. It's in pretty much every single packaged food. But I mean, I've seen so many people, even when they switch to a keto diet, have some pretty good progress and feel great, maybe drop some weight, lower their inflammation, but then hit a plateau and can't seem to figure out what's going on. I dig in deeper and I find out that they're eating a massive amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And even if that's like eating tons of bacon, things like that. I mean, pork and poultry in this country, because they're fed corn, soy, et cetera, they're monogastric animals and cannot convert those into saturated fats. And so you have a very high amount of polyunsaturated PUFAs there as well. But I guess your sort of hierarchy of how you would walk someone through how to think about nutrition as far as here's number 1, here's number 2, 3, 4, et cetera.
Yeah. So you and I chatted very briefly before we went online about how, both of us happen to be involved in ventures with regards to nutrition. And I feel strongly that those of us that know ought to be involved to some degree. We ought to be part of the solution. And so my paradigm is, to make it simple, and memorable. I kind of touched on earlier. I believe the first step is control carbohydrates. And I say that because you can simply give that advice to someone: control your carbs, keep them to 50 grams per day, and they can get off their insulin if they're an insulin-treated type 2 diabetic within just a week or two. I mean, the resulting improvement is so profound and undeniable that it's led me to just put that first. Now, immediate sort of result. It is. Yeah, it is. So I control carbs and once again, focus on, just the less refined, the better. And then prioritize protein, make sure you're getting a good amount of protein in the diet. And that has to come from animal protein, as inconvenient as that is these days. Plant protein is inferior in every single quality. So prioritize protein, and nature has protein come with fat. And when you eat fat with protein, it helps the protein be digested better. And that could be why fat and protein is more anabolic at muscle growth than just protein alone. So it's one of the things people have gotten wrong in prioritizing protein. We'll take like 2 scoops of whey protein, and that's not the way nature intended. Protein is supposed to come with fat. And that's the third pillar for me. Fill all remaining calories with fat. Fat does not spike insulin unless you've consumed it at the level of around 500 or so calories. Fat alone doesn't have an insulin spike. And so there's a power to that nutrition. And again, focus on animal fats and fruit fats. These are fats that we as a species have been eating since time immemorial. The animal fats are obvious, and the fruit fats are sometimes less obvious, so I'll just define it. That is when a fat is coming from the flesh of a fruit, like an avocado or a coconut or an olive, when our ancestors simply needed to physically squish it. We just needed to compress it. Even our own gravity from our own body mass was enough to get the oil from the flesh of these fruits. And of course, we studiously avoid, to your point, seed oils. And that does mean someone has to eat, they have to be very careful with packaged foods, because as you said, almost all of them will have soybean oil or some similar refined seed oil. And then the last pillar is just engage or utilize, leverage intermittent fasting, whatever it would look like for whatever person, whether it's alternating days or time restricted eating within one day. There's so many ways to do it. Just get off that cycle of constantly eating and constantly spiking insulin. And Jason Fung, of course, is a pioneer in that regard. And he found in his insulin-dependent type 2 diabetics, they got off all their insulin just through intermittent fasting in about 2 weeks, which is just a shocking rate of reversing that disease. So those are the pillars: control carbs, prioritize protein, fill with fat, and fast. And a lot of ways people could do that. And these are simple concepts. That doesn't make them easy, because one of the consequences is once you start doing this, it means you have to generally take the time to plan and prepare meals, unless you have someone like Anthony or Ben who has some easy solutions from time to time.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, even with fasting, you sort of highlight this in the book briefly about, there can be too much thing as fast as
yes.
fasting too much. And it's that, getting into the starvation mode is actually detrimental.
Yep.
So I'd love for you to just highlight a little bit on that, because I think when people think about fasting, more is better all the time.
Yeah, well said. In fact, I'm glad you're letting us elaborate on that. Yeah, I sometimes get a little afraid, a little worried when I see how popular fasting has become so quickly, where I see people who, I had a student in a class, this young woman, and she would come and kind of brag about how she was just finishing a 5-day fast. And I'd look at that scrawny little gal and just think to myself, this is not right. You are just masking an eating disorder. That was my fear. And in a bigger way, I think that is a problem, where some people will do like, I'm eating one meal a day, and they haven't planned well enough or developed the discipline to control what they eat when they do eat. And it ends up becoming this sort of glamorous binge purge cycle. They binge in the evening and they stuff themselves full and they're sick, and then they sort of recommit, oh, tomorrow I'm going to fast all day and I'm not going to binge in the night. And they do it again, and they do it again and again. It just becomes this vicious cycle. So fasting is something that I think is an incredibly powerful tool. And maybe because of that, it's also one that can be used inappropriately to great harm. So when someone's fasting, I just encourage people to be very deliberate, have a very solid plan, and most importantly, have a plan for how you end your fast. What you eat when you break your fast is the most important part of a fast. So have a plan, realize that you're going to become full quite quickly, and so eat a modest amount, take a little break, and then come back as you need to. But fasting is effective. It just can go too far. And the too far is, of course, when it's getting into the range of something like anorexia, where someone is chronically so energy deprived that they have such an incredible cortisol spike in particular, and that ends up actually causing insulin resistance. It's almost like the body, as insulin is elevated, is trying to hold on to whatever energy it can, because insulin tells the body to store energy. That's one of its thematic effects across all the cells in the body. And so it's no surprise that in something like chronic starvation, chronic fasting, we could call it, although there's a difference between fasting and starvation, but if the fasting sort of spills into starvation, then you do become insulin resistant. So you start to undo really any of the benefit and beyond, with additional harm by going too far.
Right. And I mean, one of the things too, touching upon your previous statement around how we dug in a little bit on stress, is that one of the things that I've done working with people as well is that sometimes people try to push fasting a little too hard in the beginning, but their life overall is so damn stressful, where they're doing 8 CrossFit workouts a week, and they're working 12 hours, and they're financially strapped, and they have kids that are now home because of COVID, they're trying to figure everything out, and they're trying to add fasting on top of that. And what I've noticed is that sometimes assessing where your stress level is at and pulling back on that before you add fasting can be effective as well, just because I think it can just be another stress in the body saying, okay, we don't have food and you're not used to doing this. Your metabolism is not set up to handle this right now. You're hungry, you're forcing it every single day, can be actually detrimental as well. So maybe there's just some nuance to this as with all stuff.
And I would say the more physically active someone is, especially high intensity like CrossFit, the more fasting is a tool they simply don't need to wield. They don't need to focus on that.
Yeah. And I think there's just People who, if you can't fast, it's probably an indication that you should be fasting to a certain degree. It's like there's a little axiom around meditation where if you can't meditate for 5 minutes, you should meditate for an hour kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that generally when we're talking about this, we're talking about people who are dealing with some sort of metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, et cetera, that using it as a tool to get back to a more appropriate baseline, you don't have to do this forever. I think afterwards you can be a little bit more in tune with your body as far as what your body is craving, whether you wake up and you're hungry and want to have a breakfast one day versus another day where you're not and you can skip a breakfast. But I think that a lot of times people just have such mixed signals from all the artificial inputs of their environment that they can't listen to their own body about what it needs.
Yeah, well said. Well, that's excellently stated. I agree. If someone they can very explicitly use intermittent fasting, very structured, very deliberate, to help them develop discipline, to help them learn to control addictions with foods. I think once they've reached a level, then it becomes more intuitive. And I hate to say that word because I think it's often cliched, where intuitive eating just in that I think it's true, but I think some people misunderstand it. But you can ideally come to this point of, if you're hungry, eat. But the flip side is even more important. If you're not hungry, don't eat.
Right.
And I think that someone can get to that point better, perhaps having gone through a very structured fast with support and good planning. They can learn that discipline and get off the schedule where they wake up and they just feel, well, I'm awake, so I have to eat. They have learned to take one step beyond that.
Right. I mean, this is just why, for example, I don't like people when they say, okay, I'm going to have a cheat meal once a week and I'm going to do really well the rest of the time, but then have a cheat meal. And then you're having all of these signals to your body that use it. You're never able to sort of calibrate as a human actually should. It's like a junkie trying to get it like, oh, I'll just have my fix once a week on a Saturday, and then I'll be good the rest of the week. You're never going to get back to baseline. You're never going to fix any of the problems you have with, if you're eating these hyper palatable foods that jack up your hormones, and your body spends a whole week trying to get calibrated again, and then you just do the whole thing over again.
Yeah, I agree. And some of those people that struggle with addictions, I think that becomes a way to just constantly get them off their plan, get them off track, and it invokes this maxim, this idea that I heard. I don't remember who's the origin, but in some people, I think it's absolutely true. Abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. So these ideas that I'm just going to have this one indulgence, that's this kind of myth in some people of perfect moderation. I just eat a little bit and I'm done. Some people simply can't do that. Once they light up the brain that way with those foods, they are unhinged. They will just go and eat until they make themselves sick. And so in those instances, for at least a significant period of time, abstinence or abstaining from those foods may be the best option. As sort of vicious or militaristic as it sounds, well, I think the principle still applies, as unpalatable as it may be.
I mean, talk about going down rabbit holes and trying to figure out sort of root cause of a lot of this stuff. This is just another thing where, I asked the question of, if people have this information, we've done a lot about education content, et cetera, yet still aren't able to adhere to some of these things, it's very clear that they're dealing with some sort of addiction to food. And then I asked myself, okay, why do people have such a high rate of addiction? And then we look at mental health issues, trauma, et cetera, and how, I've sort of thought of it now that just any sort of addiction, whether it's to drugs, alcohol, social media, anything, yes, you have sort of like psychological element here, but I think that there's also just an unprocessed emotion that is not happening, that, we have such a problem with mental health now due to a variety of reasons. And this is just now, the rabbit hole goes deeper, of course, but not sure if you've done any sort of digging regards to like addiction and sources of that with the work that you've done.
No, not at all. I'll just leave it there. Nope, that is a totally unfamiliar territory for me. All I do is I acknowledge that it is there and that it's a vicious thing that we need to acknowledge when it comes to helping people control diet. It's not as simple as just giving them these clever ideas.
Right. I mean, this is where this is a lot of the research that I've done over the last year and a half too, is just, where does this come from? And now we're looking at mental health being tied to physical health so intimately. And just the solutions we have for mental health are so much harder than for physical health. And we're talking about all this complexity and how hard it is for stuff that you can visually see and track and do. And then we get to this weird ephemeral sort of mental health bucket of are you well or unwell? You can't measure it quantitatively. So how can you really manage it? And that has become, I think, and will be an issue moving forward as we just see rates of suicide, rates of addiction, things like this skyrocketing as well. So it's just, yeah, I guess another rabbit hole to fall down and get lost into. But I mean, to go back to sort of like we were saying before, this is kind of a strategy for people to get out of the woods if they're in a spot where they're insulin resistant. Let's say that they're doing a lot of these strategies, but really want to eat, carbohydrate rich foods at some point. Is there hope for people to eat real foods later on? Or is it just like, okay, if you've had a certain amount of damage to your metabolism, you're going to be, pushed down this route and you can't go back ever again?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can say it's a good question because I don't believe it's explicitly been answered. I'm unaware of a study that's done, reversed someone's diabetes with low carb diet and seen the degree to which they can kind of titrate the carbs back in. So I can't answer that with data in mind, which I'd like to, but I can speculate. To a degree, I think someone can. If they reach a level they're comfortable with, they've realized many or all of their health goals, like perhaps losing weight and reversing their diabetes and hypertension and infertility or whatever it may be. I do think that that is a point where they can now experiment, but they have to be careful because once again, I fear that as they start to flirt with these foods again, they run the risk of just pushing themselves right down the very path they just got off. So, but nevertheless, let's assume that someone is able to do this, then it would be to just sort of start sprinkling the carbs back into the diet in limited degrees and just seeing what's happening in your body. And then hopefully being attuned, whether it's because they have, the levels, the continuous glucose monitor, or whether they're measuring their ketones or, really being careful with analyzing body composition or whatever. When they see the trend starting to go in the wrong direction, they just have to have the support externally or the internal mental fortitude to recognize it. And despite the pleasure of having incorporated those foods back into the diet, they have to be able to stop and realize, okay, I've reached my point. I can't go beyond this. Because the sad reality in most people that have at least full-blown type 2 diabetes, or insulin resistance, prediabetes, is that to a degree they are intolerant of carbohydrates. That is a body that does not metabolize carbohydrates very well. And that is evidenced in the fact that the glucose is that's rising in the blood. Of course, triglycerides are too, actually. So we could also say that they're not metabolizing fat well, and I would agree with either of those. But this is the person who, if you gave them a load of carbohydrates, it will take them multiples longer to clear that carbohydrate than someone who's insulin sensitive. So at least part of the problem can be explained by a carbohydrate intolerance, which means, unfortunately, they're never going to be able to eat as liberally as they would like with carbohydrates. But I do think someone can absolutely get to a point where they can start to enjoy it more. And hopefully they have developed the discipline along that journey to be able to, for example, eat one cookie at an event, at a party, and stop at one cookie rather than having that turn into 10 or 20.
Right. And I think that when looking cellularly or metabolically, I think that the way I view it is that there may be some irreparable damage, which you just need to live with moving forward. And the example that I give often is, if you're walking down the street and you trip off of a curb and sprain your ankle, you just roll it, you're going to be fine in 6 to 8 weeks. You're going to feel problems there, but eventually you will have full function of the ankle. If you're doing the same thing, but there's a big pothole and then you break your ankle, you might have a little bit of limited mobility structurally moving forward. If you walk off of a curb and get your foot run over by a bus and have to have rods and stuff like that put in, or even your foot amputated, like your function is going to be permanently changed. And there's just a spectrum here, I think, metabolically, where people probably have some damage. Again, it's really hard to measure and have any sort of indicator of what you can tolerate, other than using some of these ways to really test, like if it's the levels monitor or something like that, or just how you feel compared to some of these foods. But just be okay and just understand that, okay, I've done a lot of damage. I mean, my past has, there's been a lot of damage. I think that I can't really tolerate a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods very well due to my sort of metabolic damage, for 10 plus years eating standard American diet when I was younger in the Midwest. But everyone's going to have a little bit different history and require a little bit different path forward and also have a different endpoint. Obviously a lot to think about here in making it easy, but I think you've done a phenomenal job at that. And I think that if we go much further, we're going to probably overwhelm a lot of people who are trying to make some positive. Really appreciate your time and everything all the work you do. So if you could point people to where that is, and you mentioned one of the products that you offer where people can find that as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Anthony, thanks again for the invitation. What a great discussion. I'm fairly active on social media, not as active as I probably ought to be. And it's never pictures of me doing anything. It's just me trying to share some insight into human metabolism. So people can find me at Ben Bikman, PhD, and Bikman's Bikman, no C, Ben Bikman, PhD on the social media platforms. And then like you said, I've started a low carb, high protein, high fat shake. I just thought there was an opportunity to do it a little better. And so I did this with a couple of my brothers, and people can learn more about that at Get Health. And health is spelled HLTH, gethealth.com. They can learn more about the shake and how they can get it. And then other than that, those are the ways people can get in touch with me. Of course, buy the book. Much of what we talked about today, with regards to the origins of insulin resistance, why it matters, and what to do about it. It's if anyone's curious about any of those topics, get the book, Why We Get Sick. And then I will just continue to plug away in my lab and answer questions with regards to human metabolism.
Appreciate it, Doc. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing, and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.